I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Justin Warren is founder and principal analyst at PivotNine, a technology consulting and analyst firm based in Melbourne, Australia. Until 2023, he was a board member at Electronic Frontiers Australia, a nonprofit national organization representing internet users. Hi, Justin. Thanks for joining us from Down Under.
My pleasure.
At KubeCon North America last year, you asked a press conference panel what they were doing to compensate open source maintainers so they don't starve. I remember those were your words. What do you think of the response you got to that question?
Well, from memory, the response was basically crickets. There was some thinking music that happened, and then people kind of tap danced around the idea of actually handing over hard cash. And I think someone commented about contributions being made in other ways, like they gave some code back and stuff, which is like not unreasonable. But yeah, I was hoping for a clearer answer. Usually when someone has a good answer, or a practiced answer at least, they can quickly find it and provide it rather than having the usual waffle of words, and it's like there's no meaning behind them all, but a lot of words occurred.
So there's two main threads to this in these discussions that I've been having lately about open source sustainability, and one of them is that sort of funding open source maintenance for the libraries everyone uses and no one pays for. I mean, are you seeing more people have decent answers to that question recently, especially since Log4Shell? Has there been an uptick in awareness about that?
I think there's an uptick in awareness. I don't think anyone has a good answer yet, which is why this is an interesting question. I mean, it's one I've been tracking for years, but I continue to focus on and ask about because it is important. The software is written by human beings who need to eat and somewhere to live. And at least in our current system, largely, that costs money. So they need to get that money from somewhere, but it also intersects with systems of incentives, and where the money comes from can influence what happens. So people are, I think, rightly concerned. Here's a bad scenario for you. So you have an important library that's being written by one person, like we had with something like TLS, or OpenSSH or something like that, which is being maintained by like one, maybe two people. They are nearly starving to death. And a nation-state actor comes along through a cutout and provides them with a certain amount of funds on the condition that certain things occur. And because they're in desperate straits, they say yes. And now we have a supply chain backdoor into who knows what. This is the kind of thing that security agencies use vetting for to determine whether or not you're a blackmail risk and so on. But this has always been the easy way in, rather than stunt hacks that you get in Hollywood movies. It's like just front up to someone important and give them a paper bag full of $100 notes. And then, funnily enough, stuff happens. So that should, I think, be a concern as well, just from a cybersecurity risk perspective. But then most of the people who are doing this as open source are doing it for their own altruistic reasons in a way, or they are supported in other ways. And we see that a lot with KubeCon projects in particular. Pretty much all of the briefings that I'm taking are open source projects that are nonetheless the majority of, if not all of, the maintainers and developers work for a particular company that has a commercial offering on the side.
Right. And we can definitely get to that because that's its own can of worms. But in the meantime, when it comes to these libraries that they're not a product necessarily, but they're important, they're depended on by other projects and products that one or two people maintain, how do you think the industry should approach that issue? Where do you think the funding should come from in that instance?
Yeah, so like I'm a filthy socialist because I live in Australia. Honestly, I think it should come from taxes because public goods are best funded by a communal effort, and the way that we normally do that is taxation. These are roads, so why don't we fund them like roads? No one expects that people go out and pave roads for free.
Right.
Although I'm sure some people with pothole-begotten roads in certain boroughs will occasionally go out and fill them in themselves because no one else is doing the job. little bit, that's how open source gets started, is someone just goes, this is broken, there's a big hole here, I'm going to go fix it myself. Taxation, I think, is an easier way of doing it because there's no cost at point of use.
Right.
But the people who are maintaining it on behalf of a large group of others can be provided with funding that is sourced on a fairly equitable basis so that they can continue to do that. And we see some jurisdictions doing that. So Germany has brought in, only fairly recently, what it calls the Sovereign Tech Fund. The nation of Germany has decided that technology is important to it as a country. So it is something that they will fund as a country. And given the global nature of technology, I think they fund people who are developing stuff locally. But there are plenty of Germans who write important software.
Right.
What they're doing there benefits everybody else as well, but particularly they are protecting their own sovereign interests. And I would certainly like to see a lot more of that. Governments do this for other nationally significant industries, usually related to defense. But we see that with the United States CHIPS Act, where semiconductors and microchips, particularly with this burgeoning, a bit overhyped AI thing, where these chips are quite important for that. And they've realized that perhaps some geopolitical challenges, we'll call them, are positioning themselves quite well. And some of those challenges do, in fact, use the state to financially support a lot of these industries.
True.
So I think that there needs to be a similar kind of scale response.
Setting aside whether or not that will happen, in the event that it did, who would distribute those funds to maintainers? Would that be something that the Linux Foundation or the OpenSSF take care of? Would the government do it directly? How do you think that would work, practically speaking?
Well, that would be up to the government procurement people and how they wanted to structure that, which is, again, it's a democratic process, so messy and sometimes fraught with failure. I think that we should probably look to those who are doing it well. We already have processes for doing this. For example, the CHIPS Act. Like, how do you make a decision about who gets the funds that have been allocated in a budget? You have procurement processes, you have evaluation processes, you have huge teams of lobbyists. There will be similar processes that we already use to distribute funds in this way. I don't think we have to come up with something completely new. We should probably learn from the mistakes of what we've tried before. Maybe don't repeat all of them for once. But I think that we don't have to think too hard about it. If we can find something, look, that's a way that governments distribute money to fund public goods. Let's just do that. The public good in this case just happens to be software.
Right. What about downstream users and private sector companies that take but don't give back? Is there some lever to pull there?
Well, tax, again, should theoretically apply equally to everyone. And that only applies to profitable companies. So you'd think the larger companies will pay more for it. There's a whole bunch of issues around tax and people's different attitudes to it. So some of them, it's easier to avoid by moving your stuff to a tax haven or structuring your affairs in a particular way to avoid paying taxes in any given nation. But again, there are global efforts to increase the minimum rate of corporate tax, for example, to crack down on some of this tax avoidance. I use tax because it's the thing that people seem to be concerned about, and the way it's happening in commercial sectors is trying to change the license. So rather than it being a free as in beer thing, that you can see the source probably later on. You can't get access to the latest and greatest unless you pay for it. And then how do you create incentives to make sure that people do? And the way that those licenses get structured depends a lot on who the people writing these licenses believe should pay. So we've seen changes. Most recently, Buoyant changed the license to Linkerd so that you only get the stable releases if you pay for it and you're above a certain size. So you have, I think it's 50-person company or something and above. And it's production use, it's not for non-production. And they say that there will be carve-outs for not-for-profits and people doing other beneficial works. So it's the structure of that's like, that looks a lot like tax. But we saw the same with HashiCorp and their business source license. Again, it's for production use. Who decides whether it's production or not? Who is it aimed at? We saw with Elastic, who were concerned that some of the clouds were running their systems. So they structure their licenses slightly differently. Again, we have the Affero GPL, which says, look, you can run it yourself as much as you like, but if you use this software to run a public service / business, like as in SaaS, then you are not allowed to do that with this software. So those all painted slightly different pictures, similar across the board at a high level. But when you get into the specific clauses of how those licenses are written, it paints slightly different pictures of who these companies believe should be paying for it.
Yeah.
And I think the rhetoric is also interesting in that they're essentially saying we have a free rider problem. We have people who are taking but not giving back. But then the nature of that giving back, I also wonder about, because you have adopted an open source license, which in theory, like when you started doing that, the idea was that, well, we want everyone to use it for free.
Yeah.
Generally, these companies did when they were smaller because adoption is hard.
Right.
And if you charge money for something, then you've got to demonstrate sufficient value. That's a lot harder when you've got only alpha level software. Where if it's free, anyone can download it, use it whatever you like. Only the first one's free. Get people hooked on your software and then suddenly jack up the price when they're good and addicted.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an option.
And that's been the complaint about changes like the ones that you mentioned, that it's a bait and switch or it's a rug pull. The suggestion I've heard about that in terms of the second thread of this open source sustainability discussion about open product business sustainability, the proposal I've heard about that is just that open product companies be more upfront from the beginning about such a license. But there does also seem to be a kind of cultural aversion in some corners of open source against the dirty idea of making money and charging money. And what do you think about that whole side of things?
Yeah, there are some complex human emotions going on there, and they vary depending on people's backgrounds and their experiences. So those are always challenging to navigate. A lot of the open source stuff was actually a reaction against previous commercial software approaches.
Right.
So the fact that we're having a reaction again, I mean, the philosophers who like dialectics will be terribly excited because we go in reaction and then a reaction to that, and that's how history moves forward. I think we need to take that into account because these are the people who are actually building these systems and software, but I don't think we should take it as gospel. It's not holy writ. We can change things and we can adapt it, and that it's in fact what has happened over time as this whole industry has developed. Like open source has won. It's everywhere. So there is clearly value in it. It's just what people are concerned about is, well, the value is there, but it seems to be being captured by specific people and they're not sharing.
Yeah.
We want you to share a bit more.
Yeah.
Rather than everything being free all the time. So then it becomes, how do we think we should structure our affairs? Who should pay for this and why? And how do they pay and how does that funds get distributed? I don't think anyone's really wrestled with that structural question. How do you structure this system with these different kinds of actors, some of whom are reluctant to pay, and then look at how do we address that? So we've got instead a bunch of individuals who are coming up with their own individual options and solutions to this rather than looking at it as a structural challenge, which is not completely fair. Like some people have tried to do, like GitHub with its sponsorship thing. I actually thought that was going to be quite a potentially good and useful thing in that it sets a precedent as a large and influential actor.
I feel like there's a but there.
Yeah, so you can say, I have some software and I want to be funded.
Yeah. Sponsor
my project, a la Patreon or individual sponsorship for that. What we find is that most people don't want to do that, but it is generally possible. I mean, even like these companies could contact the maintainers and directly and say, would you like some cash?
Yeah.
Many people will say yes to that question.
Sure.
But you do still need to make it a bit easier, I think, to advertise that, yes, I will accept sponsorship for that. Yeah, but then we come to that question which we mentioned earlier about, well, who's paying for this and then what does that mean?
Yeah.
Because having spoken to many of the companies, when they are selling their commercial offering, they do sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly say one of the things you get when you pay for the commercial thing is you get to influence the direction that this software moves in. You get to influence roadmap and what we work on because you're paying for it and everyone else isn't.
Right.
So who benefits? That's a question that we need to ask about. Well, who's paying for this and what direction might they be taking it in?
True. Do you favor any of the business source license? There's also the delayed open source approach. Do any of those seem more viable than others to you, or do you think we haven't found the right answer yet?
I don't really like them a lot. I prefer the ones where you can actually see the source and you can fix your own problem. Like that's the main reasons for that we want to have open source so that we can see what's actually going on. And then when the software is broken or when we find a security issue or something, if the vendor disappears or the vendor is slow to fix something or they don't want to, you can fix it yourself. Or you can pay someone else. And this is where it gets a bit thorny, where you have proprietary software. As a commercial company, if I'm using your product and you don't do something for it, the benefit of open source is I can go and pay a smart boffin to come and fix the thing for me. I don't have to rent this thing from you forever. And that goes a bit against certainly the modern trend of software companies with SaaS. People are trying to set up perpetual revenue streams. So you rent everything forever. And when you're spending $10 a month on every tool, those $10 a month all add up.
Yep, sure do. It's like streaming services.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, it's like the maintenance and operations of stuff, that's the hard bit. Building the software in the first place, yeah, that's tricky. But I like to say that the first 80% is putting bugs into the software and the other 80% is taking them out again, which the astute listener will note adds up to 160%, which means you're on the cusp of an important insight about IT project management.
Indeed. So how do you see this playing out? I've heard the prediction that there will be continued chaos for a couple years, but that things will eventually change to become more sustainable. But that's obviously not a requirement. So what do you think?
Well, at the limit, the developers will starve to death and stop developing software. But then someone else can pick it up and move on, because that's the benefit of open source, is that someone else can fork it and run it off in a different direction. I think we'll see continued experimentation with business models. A bunch of product-led growth companies have determined that to run a commercial company, you actually need to make a net profit, because if you're not, you are running a charity.
Right.
And previously, the VCs were very generous donors to a bunch of technology charities, which was great for consumers because we got a bunch of surplus for free. They have discovered that they have what one of my business school professors used to call an opium problem. OPM, other people's money. When you take other people's money, often they want it back. And now that interest rates aren't zero anymore, people are discovering that, we actually need to charge enough to make enough money to pay the costs of this thing and also deliver a surplus to our investors. I think that change is causing a lot of companies to do what they probably should have done years ago and what we have been advising our clients to do all the way through the zero interest rate period, is to find a way that when you're selling a product to someone, the best way of knowing if it's any good is that they agree with you for money. So you need to understand what your cost base really is and make sure that you are pricing it deliberately and that, sure, you can run it under cost. How long can you run that for? Are you going to get sufficient market penetration when you're running with penetration pricing strategy? And what happens later when you go to jack the price up? Are you just going to try to pull the main play, which seems to be, right, get enough scale and obtain a monopoly and then charge monopoly rents, which seems to be the only strategy a lot of these companies understand? Or is there a way that you can deliver sufficient value to customers that they are willing to pay you money that delivers a reasonable rate of return without gouging them to death? But for a lot of this, you've just spent more than a decade, several decades in fact, training all of your customers to expect the price to be near zero. And now you're discovering that we don't like what we trained our customers to do?
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah.
That's going to take time to unwind. But we also, on the flip side, we now also have a change in attitude from a lot of the people who are purchasing this stuff, certainly in some sectors, where those who have been paid quite well to work in these industries are actually fairly willing to provide at least some funding semi-directly to the people they know are doing this. It's not a large enough pool yet, but we already do have a kind of mini crowdsourcing or friends of friends funding or mutual aid type situation going on. Anarchy is an interesting approach to organizational structures. Don't think it's going to scale particularly well, but I think when we try all of these different ways, we will see bits that work in different areas. Someone smart will come along and look at how can we create a structure that steals all the best ideas and puts them all in one place and makes as few mistakes as possible And the path to success is largely about avoiding more mistakes than everybody else. So I am excited to see other countries experiment like Germany. I would love to see the US start thinking about software rather than purely hardware with semiconductors, and maybe have an equivalent of the CHIPS Act for strategic important software. There's certainly a lot of interest in cybersecurity mechanisms, and there is some investment happening there. I'd love to see some more of that to make sure that we at least shore up the stuff that underpins everything else.
Right.
Like the critically important, really low-level baseline stuff like operating systems and security protocols and a few other projects. Like, yeah, that's not super fair that some people will miss out, but the stuff that 90% of companies and individuals, ourselves, 90% of our societies run on this stuff, it'd be great to see that funded well so that it can be maintained well.
Well, we'll certainly see. It'll be worth watching for sure. And thank you, Justin, for taking the time to chat with us. Appreciate your insights.
It has been my great pleasure.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 1, Text Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariseau, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about open source principles and sustainability. Thank you for being with us so far.